Hello and welcome to the Talk Daries. I'm Tanya Beckett and I am delighted to have with me once again Enrique Escalante, who is Assistant Professor at the Texas Tech University and also Assistant Professor of Economics at Angelo State University. Enrique, it's great to see you again. There is much to talk about.
Uh, Great to be back, Tanya. It's always a pleasure talking to you.
Well, it's dark here and it's not there, so that indicates that we are in the evening in the UK and it's still pretty miserable and cold. What's the weather like where you are?
It's pretty sunny, though it's a little cold. It's going to get colder over the weekend here in Texas too.
Good, right. Well, so we're on the same page in that way. Um, let's just turn to the US economy. There's been lots of various political developments, I think it's fair to say, over Greenland in particular, Venezuela, of course, too. But I think for many people, the question becomes when President Trump starts crashing around on the international political stage, at what point is it going to start undermining the the US economy and the UK economy for that matter, but the US economy in particular? Because we are seeing strong growth rates at the moment. And in some ways that's puzzling people. And it seems to be defying gravity because many economists seem to say, well, look, if you start imposing these tariffs, then it's going to damage the US economy. It will damage the world economy. Well, the US economy seems to be tripping along just fine. But some people say that it is a K-shaped economy. So explain, if you would, how it is that we can see growth rates of over 4% in the United States with everything that's going on, and this question of what a K-shaped economy means.
Okay, well, I think the first thing that I want to say is that probably people were too quick to try to predict that what was going to happen with this administration was going to be terrible. And when those predictions didn't materialize, then what you would expect is that probably most people would say that economists were wrong about these predictions. In fact, that's what happened with tariffs when some pundits and politicians, they say, well, it will just trigger some inflation. And that didn't happen because most of these models actually assume that several countries would be retaliating. Also, the United States, the US economy doesn't depend entirely on free trade. It's a large and diversified economy. So we wouldn't expect that even when things were not going very well or smooth with free trade or with foreign trade, with international trade, then the US economy would suffer noticeably. And of course, that's not what happened. The countries didn't retaliate, and the US economy was still robust to these problems with the international trade.
And of course, it's worth saying that he sort of negotiated out a lot of the rather extreme tariffs, didn't he? So the headlines actually were not what in the end happened, that we do have tariffs, which are higher compared to modern times, but not astronomically so.
No, that's true. And definitely they will have an effect. They will increase prices. They are already increasing prices, but for the most part, they have been absorbed by US importers. And there is probably a small amount that is paid in the form of higher prices for foreign producers, but most of the burden of the tariffs has been absorbed by US importers and also US consumers. What it seems it will happen over these following months probably was that these tariffs will translate even more in higher prices for US consumers. And that is pushing and contributing to some concerns about affordability in the US.
Mm. And this is where the K-shaped part comes in, because what we're seeing is that the percentage of people who are able to do the spending is very small. It's just they're able to do a lot of the spending. So it's really, I suppose, an extreme push on the wealth gap, isn't it? Is that what we mean by K-shape? What does it denote?
Well, the K-shape is this idea in which you can see that different sectors or different groups of the population have different patterns of growth. Some of them seems to be growing more, and some of them remain stagnant. Um, but I think we should be careful when we try to define the U.S. economy as K-shaped economy, because part of this rhetoric has also fueling uh, the candidacy and the political relevance of Donald Trump, right? So the president basically ran a campaign saying that things are going horrible for this country, that the US has been one of the losers of the global economy and globalization in
Mm.
general. And that is simply not true, right? The US has been actually one of the greatest winners of the process of globalization and free trade over the recent decades. So when we say like, yes, there has been some group of the population that probably has been doing worse over recent years, I think we need to calibrate that a little bit, right? Because what people seem to suggest is that houses, for example, have been increasing in prices, and now it's just more difficult for people to get the opportunities and the standards of livings of their grandparents. But when we are careful about that, we have to point out that, for example, housing in the past, in the 1970s, which is a decade that for some reason they like to mention, they were smaller. They didn't have a garage. People didn't eat out like we regularly do
Mm.
nowadays. And they didn't send their kids to college, right? It was not, now it's basically the rule. The kids go to college. We have bigger houses, bigger cars. We constantly eat out. So in many ways, the standards of living have improved within the US, right? So when we try to say like there has been some people suffering from this globalization and some people have been doing better, I think there are many things that we can improve, and there are some things that still we can do better in the US. But I would be careful to try to fuel that rhetoric and say like, hey, so there is a group of people that has been getting poorer, and there is another group of people that have been doing much better. Now,
Yes,
having said that, yes,
mm.
yeah,
but
go ahead, please.
just really in the current context, what we're seeing, and I'll point to the stock market here, is a 30% rise in the stock market since the announcements of the tariffs. Clearly, some of that was bounced back, but a lot of it's driven by artificial intelligence. Some of it, probably defense stocks as well. But if you look at the beneficiaries of that, they are able to pay any higher prices that are caused by tariffs. Those who are not benefiting from that, on the other hand, are not. So that's what we mean by K-shape, that some people are doing really well, I suppose, and other people are doing less well. And probably the reason they're doing less well is because of inflation. And here's the irony, that if Donald Trump was saying that some people have not benefited from globalization, and that was certainly the feeling probably that started off after the financial crisis, and it underpinned Brexit certainly in the UK as well, and many other things too. But he's not helping that if prices are going up for ordinary people, is he? Or am I seeing this wrong?
No, I think you are correct. Once we distinguish between these two narratives, it is accurate to say that yes, some people have been benefiting recently. There is a certain pattern in which people that own stocks and assets have been growing their economic relevance, while some groups confront higher prices and some inflationary pressures. Why the president is confronting the possibility that the U.S. Consumers will face higher prices over the upcoming election is still a mystery, right? So you wake up one morning and then you see that the president is threatening some European countries with higher tariffs.
Right.
But a more accurate headline would be to say that the president is actually threatening U.S. consumers with higher prices, because that's ultimately what it means when you try to impose tariffs on U.S. countries, on European countries, right? It translates as higher prices and potentially higher, higher prices for the U.S. consumers.
Right, but I mean, one could argue this is saber rattling, and actually, this is just the mechanism that he uses to get people to the negotiating table, and so he is hoping that it will be absorbed before that point. But it's a high wire act. That's the point, right? It's a high stakes game that he's playing.
Yes, especially because I think it's becoming predictable. to some degree. Also, it's impractical. How is it that tariffs are going to be imposed on European countries, specifically a subset of the European countries, when there is a free flow of goods and services within the European Union?
Yeah,
And
there is
on
that
the
for you.
other, yeah, so it's indeed impractical. What it seems to be the case is that also probably this week or I think this week I think the Supreme Court will fail on the idea of the power of the presidency to establish on taxes on Americans, right, and on tariffs. So it may leave the administration without one of the main tools of negotiations, even though they may have some different plans to try to continue with this strategy. But I don't know. Sometimes it's very difficult to find a logic within some of the moves of the administrations. And it's even more complicated when you try to find what is the economic logic of trying to increase prices for Americans, especially when we are about to confront an election.
Well, and the other problem is this business of uncertainty, and we've seen the moves by ICE, the border force, in trying to remove illegal immigrants, but the US is structured in such a way that it is actually very reliant on immigrants as a whole, and when the confidence in that is disrupted, that presumably has a very dangerous effect. It's a dangerous threat to businesses as a whole. Many businesses, farms to retail, many of them.
Well, yeah, there has been some prediction actually that this year, the shock or the impact of the immigration will translate into higher prices too, right? Because we
Now, how does
didn't
that
see
work?
that,
How does that
obviously.
work? I have to think about that one. How does that work?
Well, what you're doing is just subtracting some part of the labor force of the United States, right? So there are industries that survive because they are able to obtain a labor force at lower prices, which is usually what the immigrants are able to provide to some industries. So the only reason these industries are able to provide goods and services to the US is because they can reduce the cost by hiring some of these immigrants and workers. So if you just remove the possibility, you're just increasing the cost for these industries, and by increasing the cost, they will just reduce the supply of whatever they're providing. So that may translate into higher prices also for the American population.
And then there is the confidence issue, which I've alluded to. Businesses don't know what they're doing because they don't know what tariff environment they're in. They don't know whether they can hire workers or not, legal ones, because, you do create an atmosphere around that. But the other thing is this attack on the Fed chair, the head of the central bank, Jerome Powell, and his unwillingness to drop interest rates faster in order to accommodate President Trump's wishes that he would like to see lower interest rates and see the economy fueled more. What are the arguments for and against dropping interest rates at the moment?
Well, I think the arguments, I think I would be, I don't want to say this is what the Fed should do, but I think there is almost a consensus that maybe we should be careful about reducing the interest rates because we still have some threats of inflation. I don't see that inflation is totally under control. We keep surpassing the goals of the Federal Reserve for inflation. So we should probably be careful. And I think the Fed has been acting with caution on reducing the interest rates. And this has been able because it tried to keep certain independence of the political power. And what we see is that probably the administration has been trying to undermine that independence. Now, having said that, I think we should also be careful on claiming that there is nothing wrong with the Fed. Right? There has been many issues in which you may argue, especially over recent years, that the Fed has not been operating entirely without the political influence, right? It has extended its powers to control the economy. It has tried to get involved into initiatives of diversity and climate change. It has tried to increase their powers to regulate markets and industries. So there are many issues and concerns with the Federal Reserve. Unfortunately, these are not the issues that the administration is raising and saying, like, we can do better with the Federal Reserve. It's actually going in the opposite direction. It's trying to undermine more the credibility and independence of the
And its
of the
central role,
federal bank.
what is central to its role, which is setting interest rates.
Yes, right, and that's another puzzling situation because I don't know how the recent events are helping President Trump's with their intention to reduce interest rates. Right? If anything, it just made the position of the chairman stronger. Right? Jay Powell now he has uh, enjoyed the support of some colleagues and some other senators saying like, we are not gonna consent any intention to undermine the independence of the Federal Reserve. So, and he may not even leave uh, when his time comes to leave the Federal Reserve. So I don't know how is
He
that
can
really
certainly still
helping.
stay on the board anyway, can't he? I mean, he'd still be around
Yeah.
in some capacity. But
Well,
the thing is,
traditionally he would leave, but probably now maybe he's less inclined to leave.
right, and can Trump force him out? I thought he could. No?
I don't think so. No, I don't
Oh,
think
really?
so. Yeah, and the Fed decisions are not also autocratic in any sense, right? It's a committee that takes the decisions and they discuss and persuade each other. So for the president to try to control that board, it will require placing more and more members over there. Um, I don't know if that is feasible, yeah, and it's even less so at this time when it seems that the markets, even the markets, I think, reacted properly, suggesting that even though there are intentions to undermine this credibility, it remains as a very strong U.S. institution.
Yes, although that is, well, we should probably highlight that. The reason that the credibility of the central bank is very important is because if it is not believed in the international markets that the head of the central bank is making decisions based on underlying economics, if they think that it's being influenced by politics, and that undermines the credibility, therefore, of the functioning of the central bank, then that could really cause havoc, couldn't it, in a country like the United States, which is so dependent on borrowing money and international investors which allow it to borrow that money. So I'm talking, of course, about the treasury market.
Yes, I think at this point the U.S. And the Federal Reserve is depending more and more on the privileged position of the U.S. dollar abroad, rather than the an independence of the central bank. It has been This independence has been undermined over recent years, and as I said, it has been exceeding its powers and mandate. So, what maintains the credibility of the Fed is not so much a central bank that is a model for other central banks, but rather than that the US has this position in which there is a war where the dollar is dominant.
Hmm. Um, Something that we've also talked about on the Talk Diaries is the fact that treasuries, i.e., US government borrowing, on which it is highly dependent at the moment, right, is many of those treasuries are held in either Japan or China. And in the way that Donald Trump has politicized tariffs, is it possible that either of those two countries would politicize their holding of treasuries and say, we're not going to hold these anymore, actually, and we'll start dumping them on the market, and that might make it very difficult for the US to continue to raise debt? Do you think that's a possibility, or they'd be shooting themselves in the foot?
No, I think that would be extremely difficult, I think, because I think the treasuries remain one of the most important assets in the war.
Hmm.
It would require also a lot of coordination and expectations. I'm pretty sure China and Japan probably will be happy that that will happen, but they are not right now in a position in which would be able to do something like that.
Okay. Let's just another sort of blip on the horizon. There have been since the summer persistent suspicions that the stock market is about to take a tumble. It hasn't really yet, not in any sustainable way anyway. And you could
Yeah.
argue what the reasons are for that. But to what extent might a sell-off in the stock market really upset the apple cart for Donald Trump, do you think? Could that be disruptive? President Trump is no fool when he watches the stock market. He understands exactly its importance. But if it looks toppy, if it looks fragile, that's not helpful, is it? If you get a sell off in the stock market, or would you argue that the stock market does not lead the economy? It's the other way around.
No, I think the stock market is a good measure of how investors and markets value the future and specific assets and companies. Um, I initially thought that the stock market would be one of the factors that would discipline this administration in terms of economic actions or economic policies. But what we have seen in the last year actually is that that's not the case, right? Even though President Trump may pay attention to the stock market before, what we saw during Liberation Day and some actions to impose tariffs on other countries, what we saw was that the administration can leave with the stock market going down, at least for a while. So I don't know if the stock market can discipline this administration in those terms anymore. And what I see also is that probably there is an overvaluation in some of the assets now. It has been growing a lot over the recent years. Some economists also agree that maybe it shouldn't be that way, and probably there will be a correction coming any point. But as usual, that is very hard to predict when that will happen.
And to finish where we started, which is a growth rate in the United States of in excess of 4%. Historically, that is a really strong growth rate, isn't it? I mean, I would think in an economy like the US, you'd be looking at more like a very developed economy like that. Sort of 2.5% would be normal. How is, I mean, 4% historically is strong, isn't it? There's no doubt about it.
Yes, it's I would say it's amazing because it's a very robust growth, and for an economy of the size of the United States, is just tremendous. Growing 4% over the last year, and it just means that the country is getting richer and richer. So there are some indications that may be a little bit concerning. Maybe for the administration and the narrative that they try to push. For example, the number of manufacturing jobs keep declining and keeps declining after President Trump has been saying
Right.
that, the tariffs should be imposed. So despite many things, the US economy keeps growing. And I think it's because this administration is conflating with this new boom and expectations about artificial intelligence, right? So that's probably the easier explanation to what was happening.
And that is the problem slightly with these broad figures, that they don't really tell a very detailed story, do they? It could be that two parts of the economy, defense and artificial intelligence, are propping everything else up, and everything else is in fact a bit of a disaster.
Yeah, it's hard to disentangle really what is pushing that. What I see is that there are some policies that are pushing in the opposite direction of growth. Uh, you know, Tariffs, immigration, um, basically trying to undermine some of the alliances or political alliances with other countries, and uncertainty and instability within the country. They go against what is needed for a sustained economic growth. On the other hand, the US still keeps the fundamentals for expanding growth, sophisticated financial markets, some degree of economic freedom, stable rules, right? The judicial framework is very stable in the US. So many of these things still seem to be dominant for producing economic growth over the long run. And that's, I think, what we are seeing. Now, those two things are going into a point in which they are following different paths. So at some point, we will have to see which one is weighing more on the US economy.
Enrique, thank you very much indeed for joining me on the Talk Daries.
It's been a pleasure, Tanya, as usual.